Station 5 in PACES has changed. The previous locomotor, eyes, skin and endocrine examination has been replaced by what's known as an integrated clinical assessment. The central aim of the ICA is to test the candidate's ability to function in a clinical context not unlike clinic or on typical on-call. The idea is that you will perform a focused history, a targeted examination and address the patient's concerns, all in 8 minutes, which is very similar to the time you'd have in a clinic or having reviewed a patient on a post-take ward round. Because the ICA is designed to mimic a clinical encounter, you don't have much time. You have only 8 minutes to make your focused history, examination, address the patient's concerns, and then 2 minutes answering the examiner's questions. There are 3 key components to the ICA. The first thing to mention is structure. So as I mentioned, you have to perform a focused history, a targeted examination and address the patient's concerns, all in 8 minutes. The second thing to mention, which is different from the previous Station 5, is that the cases won't be limited to the locomotor, eyes, endocrine and skin systems. Having said that, because those systems are underrepresented elsewhere in the exam, it's likely they'll crop up with a higher frequency in this station still. The third important thing is that the marking system has changed, and in Station 5 is the only station, the integrated clinical assessment, in which you're assessed on all 7 criteria of the marking system. I find it easier to remember the 7 criteria for the marking system in 2 chunks. In the first 4 criteria, you're being assessed on your ability to perform a physical examination, your ability to identify key physical signs, your ability to take a history, as in clinical communication, and your ability to formulate a differential diagnosis. In the second section of the marking system, as I like to see it, you're being tested on your ability to manage the patient's concerns, to maintain the patient's welfare, and on your clinical judgment, your ability to formulate an investigative and management plan. So it's likely in the integrated clinical assessment, the first 4 criteria will be assessed during your 8 minutes with the patient, and the last 3 during your 2-minute examination, in which the examiner asks you a series of questions about the case. So what's the best strategy with which to approach the integrated clinical assessment? I think one of the most important points is that if you try to do the history taking, examination and address the patient's concerns in a rigid order, it's very likely you'll run out of time and you'll fail to do at least one of those properly. It's perfectly acceptable, for example, to take the history whilst you're examining the patient. 8 minutes is a very short period of time in which to do this. Remember that in the other stations, when you're examining, you have time to get your thoughts together and get an idea of what you're going to say to your examiner. In this station, you have to think on your feet. That might seem quite daunting, but it's actually quite liberating. What the examiners want to see is how you perform in a normal clinical environment. So what you need to do for this station is simply approach it just as you would do an on-call or a clinic encounter. There are 3 key pitfalls to avoid in the integrated clinical assessment. The first is to make sure you identify the patient's concerns. These are not necessarily the same thing as their symptoms. This is what the whole station is about. The second thing is to make sure you identify the clinical problem. This is a problem-solving station, and make sure by the end of it you've got a proper investigative and management plan to address it. The third thing is keep an eye on the time. Remember, you're being assessed on all 7 criteria of the marking scheme in a short space of time, and you need to demonstrate competence in each of those.